Good to be here. Thanks for the OrdsR team. Nice to see you all. All right. I had an interesting start of the day. I had two choices to make. I had bank robber or Ethereum NFT, and I decided that this would be least offensive to the audience today. So again, hey, I'm Domo. Great to be here. We'll start off with how I got into Ordinals. This was the first thing I inscribed. It's my punk, obviously. Just missed the sub 10K with this, but I used Ord bot at the time, so shout out to them. One funny thing about this is it's not a Bitcoin punk, it's a SVG file. So I unfortunately missed the Bitcoin punk bank, so I'm patiently waiting for Bitcoin SVG punk. So if someone wants to create that, I'll have the first one. And then here on the right is the first inscription that I bought on a secondary marketplace. It's an Ordinals Faces by Pads and Bones World. So this is really what got me into PSBTs. Okay, so how do we get here? Some of you will recognize that plot on the left. This is from my Ordinals Marketplace dashboard on Dune Analytics. The way I got into this was at the start of the year, I was trying to build my brand in on-chain analytics in the space, mainly with Ethereum, some Solana, et cetera, And then while I was degenning with Ordinals, I thought, why is no one doing Ordinals on-chain data analysis? So I started with Sats names, made a tracker for them, and that really helped me learn the nuances of Bitcoin data. From there, I went into Ordinals marketplaces and this chart right here. And like to me, like this is almost like a work of art. Like there's no, if you've been in the space for a while, like you've never seen kind of like a market share kind of power battle like this. And I think this war is far from being won. So really excited to see how this plays out in the months to come. And then, so at this point, now I'm pretty comfortable with Bitcoin data. And Sats names comes out. And the interesting thing I think about Sats names is if you think about these logic jumps that are required in these meta protocols or protocols. So for Ord, basically it's FIFO. For Sats names, it's first is first. It kind of made me the realization that social consensus can exist with these protocols. And if you don't jump too far, you can make something that works and everyone accepts, right? So when I saw this tweet by Red from Crypto, I pretty much ran to my computer and sat at it for about 12 to 48 hours and just smashed it out, and BRC-20 was created within 48 hours of this tweet. All right, so what is BRC-20? At its core, it's simple, right? Like, you'll hear me say this time and time again today. Simple, simple, simple. And at its essence, there's three main functions. So you have deploy, which you can equate to deploying a smart contract on Ethereum, basically. You're claiming the namespace of the ticker. And in doing so, you now activate the mint. And people can mint upon the parameters that you set in the deploy function. All right? So ironically, the reason I set this distribution mechanism was because I was coming from Ethereum, and I knew if I did anything extractive at all, the Bitcoin maxis would try to hung, draw, and quarter me. So I did this fair open mechanism to copy most closely to Bitcoin's ethos. So that led to this mint mechanism, which you could claim portions of the supply that was laid out in the deploy function. Finally, we have a transfer function, which occurs in two phases. You inscribe the transfer function to yourself, and then you send it to its final destination to prove intent of that transfer, right? And then when you add all these functions together, you get the state, your total balance. So that's really how BRC-20 works at a super core simple. All right, so I like to explain things with analogies, right? And I'm going to lean on a past life as a chemical engineer here and explain an analogy using natural gas. So if you can imagine, natural gas is typically in its gaseous form, especially when it's produced and consumed. However, when you want to transport it, typically you convert it, you phase change it into its liquid form, and in doing so, you bind it to the container. So in this case, this tanker, right? So wherever that tanker goes, that gas goes as well. So we expand this to BRC-20, you can think the same. So its natural form is this unbound gaseous form, but if you want to transfer it, you have to bind it to something. But instead of binding it to a ship here, you're binding it to Satoshi. So in doing so, you now inherit the anti-double spend features of Bitcoin, and that balance will go wherever the Satoshi goes. Finally, when it arrives in its final destination, it phase changes again back into its natural form of unbound or gas. And if you want to do another transfer, you just repeat the process. All right, I think this is my favorite slide. So why did BRC-20 succeed? And there's some things I agree from in the last panel, but some things I disagree on. So in its essence, I think two things. Simplicity, so ease of understanding, and ease of access. So simplicity, once again, I'm talking about it again. You really need to, like, in order for these social consensus protocols to succeed, you need it for it to be simple, right? You need people to understand. So BRC-20, as you saw earlier, is 3 functions. That's all you need to know. It's very easy. Like, I think most, maybe not all maxis have the reading comprehension to understand it, but some do. And the ease of access, I think what really made me interested in building on Ordinals was that I have the opinion that with inscription tools, on writing arbitrary data to a chain has never been easier, on any chain ever. And that's because all you have to do is send Bitcoin from A to B if you're using inscription service. And there's some trustfulness there, but usually it's not large amounts of Bitcoin. And you can put that Bitcoin on a chain. So anyone that has Bitcoin in any wallet can participate in this network. So that's what really brought me in there, right? So I also like using memes to describe things, right? So I'm turning this one a little bit on its head. So as a middle curve person myself, I value these as features, so simplicity and ease of access, right? But I found that a lot of my biggest critics don't value these as features for whatever reason. And I've also found that they reside on either ends of the spectrum typically, right? The one thing they do have in common is they both think that they're on the right side of the spectrum. So because they don't value this, they don't use it. But if you remember from calculus, if you take the integral of the curve, the largest part of the area is in this middle area, right? And if you go back to the question, why did BRC-20 succeed? It's because this is where the most people reside. Okay, so what would a Domo data presentation be without some stats? So everyone's favorite metric of Ordinals is inscription numbers, right? So I think BRC-20 now has 25 million inscriptions. So that's about 3% of Bitcoin transactions ever. And for reference, it wasn't until about 2014 before Bitcoin hit 25 million transactions total. So quite a cool metric, but some people see it as a vanity metric. So I'll move on to some more concrete facts. So 1,500 Bitcoin in miner fees. So if there's miners in the crowd, I'm available for a beer later. You owe me one. 200,000 addresses have inscribed a BRC-20, over $100 million in on-chain volume, and $3 billion in centralized exchange volume. Okay, so before moving on to what the future holds, which I think most people are interested in, I just want to go back to some core principles that I like to really emphasize when I talk about BRC-20. So the first one is KISS, so keep it simple, stupid. Again, with the simplicity, right? Like you have to think that we're dealing with social consensus here, so if you make aggressive complexity, you add it arbitrarily, that social consensus breaks down very easily. So you really have to create a protocol that has the least amount of disagreement vectors, right? And in that way, you can maintain social consensus and avoid forks of different kinds. The next is the fine balance of indexing and governance. So I think an interesting phenomenon that occurred because no one open sourced their indexing software is we now have actually quite a diverse client set of indexers. So we have 5 or 6 indexers out there that all came up with their own implementation independently, which is great if you're trying to create a system that's robust and everyone can check against each other. However, if you think about it, this diversity now makes it very difficult to update the standard. So if I want to update a standard, what I have to do is I have to then go and socialize the update to each and every indexer. I then have to validate with my implementation against every single indexer, get them to validate against one another. And if you can imagine, this becomes very prohibitive very quickly. So I think these two combined have maybe led to the slow progress of BRC-20, especially because there's a lot of money on the line now. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize my thinking in the last couple of months of BRC-20. But that's not to say that this has to stay this way forever. I think there are some ways that you can sort of navigate this balancing issue. And number one, which I announced earlier, on the indexing side is back in June, I announced I was working with Alex to create the OnChain Indexer for BRC-20. And we see this is the first phase of that project. So the BRC-20 Oracle. And what is that? So the idea here is we boost robustness of indexing by validating these off-chain indexers, so OKX, Best in Slot, Unisat, and Hero, against one another using Alex software. Alex then compares them, validates them, and then tests to it on-chain every block, right? So it has the ability to, you now have a slightly more robust indexing situation. And remember, this is just step one of this process. In the future, we hope to do smart contract indexing, which makes it much more of a trustless situation. So just wanted to shout out Alex here. They've been really great to work with. And yeah, we're continue building. So if you want to follow updates here, just follow their Twitter. The next thing, so if you can imagine, we've got indexing sorted out here if you're balancing it again. The next thing is governance. So how do you go about governance? So the idea we have here, so I've worked with Bernari from Best in Slot and Oil, Taga if you know him, to create the Layer 1 Foundation. The idea here is that it's the platform, the front page for meta protocol development. So basically a venue for discourse and development of meta protocols. Idea being that if you do it in an open, transparent way, you then boost this governance side. So now we've got the indexing and the governance. We can move ahead with updating the standard. So if you want to follow us there, we're launching this today. So super exciting. Yeah, and then the last thing, right? So this indexing versus governance phenomenon that I was saying, that's what was holding back BRC-20 from being moved ahead with certain updates, right? So if we've got those two figured out, the idea or the hope is that we can move ahead with some updates. So what kind of updates can you expect? So I think there's definitely some low-hanging fruit. Things like optimization, efficiency, things that have been done well by other standards that can be implemented to BRC-20 with relatively low lift, to some more ambitious projects that are like separate envelopes or a tagging system, which would allow less reliance on ORD or other protocols. And then the final thing, which I think is the most requested thing, is like, how do you get complexity into the system? So that's very difficult if you go back to thinking, well, I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. So solution that I've long said is the way to do it is modular complexity. So the reason I say modular complexity is because if you think about ERC-20, it'd be pretty preposterous to propose the ERC-20 dev to implement Aave, Uniswap, OpenSea into the ERC-20 contract itself, right? Like that's what the people that are asking me to add a DEX function to BRC-20 are asking. That's the same thing. So it would be crazy and the social consensus would break down very quickly. So to counteract that, I think modular complexity is the way forward. And again, there's many ways that you can go about it. For a couple months, I thought I had the solution, but it's quite it has a bad user experience and some trustfulness. So recently, I've been talking to Unisat, which have an interesting implementation, and Lorenzo will probably talk about it today. Of course, nothing's confirmed, but if you want to get updates for this, you have to follow the discourse forums on Layer 1F, and this is where this discussion will happen in an open and transparent way. So thanks for having me, everyone. Great to be here. Have a great day.